One thing I appreciate most about the liturgical church year is that as the years go by, every year it provides touchstones along the way. And for me, Martin Luther King Jr. Sunday always provides a touchstone for me to kind of do my annual justice checkup. Not for just me individually, but for us as a community. To ask ourselves, how are we doing? And are we doing our part in bending that moral arc toward justice? So each year I read things from Martin Luther King Jr. to see how far or not we've come. Are you with me so far? Okay. You heard Julian read Martin Luther King's speech right down the road here at Stanford. Let me continue with that for a moment from excerpts from that speech, because he continues, "We must see that the struggle today is much more difficult. It's more difficult today because we are struggling now for genuine equality. And it's much easier to integrate a lunch counter than it is to guarantee a livable income and a solid job. It's much easier to guarantee the right to vote than it is to guarantee the right to live in sanitary, decent housing conditions. It's much easier to integrate a public park than it is to make genuine, quality, integrated education a reality. And so today, we are struggling for something which says we demand genuine equality. It's not merely a struggle against extremist behavior toward Negroes. America, you have failed to hear. America has failed to hear that the plight of the Negro poor has worsened over the last few years. It has failed to hear that the promises of freedom and justice have not been met. And it has failed to hear that the large segments of white society are more concerned about tranquility and the status quo than about justice, equality, and humanity. Racism is not based on some empirical generalization. It is based rather on an ontological affirmation. It is not the assertion that certain people are behind culturally or otherwise because of environmental conditions. It is the affirmation that the very being of a people is inferior. And this is the great tragedy of it. I submit, he goes on to say, that however unpleasant it is, we must honestly see and admit that racism is still deeply rooted all over America. It is still deeply rooted in the North, and it is still deeply rooted in the South. And this leads me to say something about another discussion that we hear a great deal, and that is the so-called white backlash. I would like to honestly say to you that the white backlash is merely a new name for an old phenomenon. It's not something that just came into being because shouts of black power or because Negroes engaged in riots in Watts, for instance. The fact is that the state of California voted a fair housing bill out of existence before anybody shouted black power or before anybody rioted in Watts. If we update the language slightly, this sounds like it could have been preached down the road at Stanford last week instead of a half century ago. This past fall, they did the San Francisco Community Health Needs Assessment, put out a report on the state of black health in San Francisco, right here in the Bay Area. Blacks represent 5.6% of the San Francisco population. Between 2000 and 2014, the African American community shrank by 27%. And my hunch is that that percentage is even higher here in San Mateo County. Life expectancy for blacks living in San Francisco is approximately 15 years less than any other racial ethnic group. 15 years less life expectancy. 70% 6% of African American third graders score lower than proficient on the English standardized test. 48% of African American children live in households earning less than 100% of the federal poverty level, and only 2% of white children do. The report goes on to talk about the disparities in health care, the disproportionate amount of cancer in the African American community. In fact, this report was so staggering that colleagues of mine, faith leaders in San Francisco, went to the city hall and asked that there be declared a state of emergency for African American children in San Francisco. So what do we do, you might ask? Well, let's turn to something that was not written a half century ago, but 2 millennia ago. Our gospel lesson for today. We have this story about Jesus inviting people to follow him. Philip decides to follow Jesus, and then he finds his friend Nathanael. And when he tells Nathanael what he's going to do and who this person is that he's going to follow, Nathanael reacts out of his own prejudices, out of his own worldview, and says, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" Remind you of anything in the news this week? Can anything good come out of Haiti or some African countries or El Salvador? For Nathanael, apparently, if this would-be Messiah was from Nazareth, that nowhere place, that backwater country town that those people were from, then Nathanael wasn't interested at all. Because then, as now, prejudice makes us so unteachable. Judgment makes us so intractable. Arrogance makes us so unkind. Philip says, well, come and see. Come and see for yourself. I don't know if any of you saw it or not. If you haven't, I suggest that you look it up. The day after those remarks came out about Haiti in particular, Anderson Cooper on CNN gave a very moving personal account. Basically, Anderson Cooper, through media, said, come and see. He had spent time there after the earthquake, spent time there vacationing, spent time there with the Haitian people who he knows and loves, and he basically said to anyone who would listen, come and see. Let me tell you about some Haitians I know. Let me tell you about my experience of that country, the undue amount of suffering that has been wrought even by Mother Nature on them. Let me tell you about the strength and the courage and the resiliency of the Haitian people I know. Come and see. Jesus says of Nathanael, I see in you someone in whom there is no deceit. In other words, Nathanael, you're just honest. Most of us hide our prejudices fairly well most of the time. We're very sophisticated in our discrimination, actually. But Nathanael was right out there. Nathanael says, where'd you get to know me? And Jesus said, I saw you under the fig tree. And that statement is what began to open up this whole passage for me. Because standing under the fig tree in those days, that phrase was a symbol of comfort and blessing. To stand under your own fig tree was to be at home. And to follow the call of Jesus, to gather around the teachings of Jesus, as we say we do here, is to move outside. It's to get out from under your own fig tree and move outside our comfort zones. That's the call. Because here's what's true, beloved community. The real work of justice will always move us outside our comfort zones. Somebody could say something right then would be good. The work of justice, real, ongoing, sustaining, societal transforming justice, will always push you and I outside of our comfort zones. In fact, I had a colleague who was teaching about justice who leads protests all over the nation say, you know, I go to these protests and sometimes I only agree with 10% of what's going on or what's said because it makes me uncomfortable. But I show up and I listen. So I'm going to ask you to join me for a moment in perhaps being moved a bit outside your comfort zone. Will you stay with me for a minute? Okay? Because it's outside of my comfort zone too. I read this book called Dream Hoarders by Richard Reeves, who's a senior fellow at economics at the Brookings Institute. Richard Reeves emigrated from Britain. He's now a citizen here. What he does in this book is he chips away at the 1% argument. He addresses the growing inequality gap experienced dramatically here on the peninsula. But he says, you know, we focus on extreme wealth. We put it on the 1%, the super rich, the very top. But he says the inequality gap, however, is much more accurately described not by extreme wealth and stubborn poverty, but the missing picture of the upper middle class. Friends, this is the class to which I belong, and perhaps to which many of you belong as well. Some of us. He calls this the top fifth or the favored fifth, those household incomes of over $112,000 annually. The gap between many of us and the other 80% is the great divide. He says this, over the last 3 or 4 decades, income equality has increased in the U.S., but only at the top. There has been no increase in inequality in the bottom 80% of the population. Now, he is among this class himself, the favored fifth. He says, we have a lot of power, but here's what he said that went right to the core of my being. We have a lot of power, but upper middle class power tends to be deployed to protect our own status and position, regardless of considerations of fairness. Having convinced ourselves of our own merit, we have become, and there is no way to say this nicely, kind of selfish. Not in the way we conduct ourselves in the thick of everyday life with our neighbors or colleagues, but selfish in terms of the bigger picture. The way we treat tax breaks as an entitlement and the way we exclude others from opportunity to serve our own ends. I'm feeling uncomfortable right this moment, are you? Richard Reeves goes on, he's actually a brilliant writer. He said he hated the snobbery in Britain and the class system there, but he says the U.S. class system is hardening here. And the thing is, we refuse to admit it. So perhaps the first step, dear friends, is for us to start paying attention, to start admitting it. Perhaps the second step is to come and see, put ourselves in closer proximity to the stories and lives of people who differ dramatically from our own, or some of our own. And to intentionally, because that's the only way it happens, to intentionally put ourselves outside our own comfort zone. Because no one wakes up in the morning and says, think I'll just step outside my comfort zone today. It has to be intentional. Because come and see what love looks like, the heart of everything that Jesus was about. Real love. Not this vague notion, this feeling of love, but love always has a body. Love is not an idea. Love lives itself out or doesn't in flesh and bone, in real lives, in real situations. I returned, and I'll close with this. I returned to a book that I've returned to many times over the years called Strength to Love by Martin Luther King Jr., and it's a collection of some of his sermons. It was on my heart this week, and so I pulled it off my shelf. I couldn't get the book off my mind, and in one of the last sermons in the book, the sermon is entitled Paul's Letter to American Christians. And I'll just read a little bit from it to close. So in this sermon, MLK says, America, I wonder whether your moral and spiritual progress has been commensurate with your scientific progress. It appears to me that your moral progress lags behind your scientific progress. Your mentality outdistances your morality, and your civilization outshines your culture. How much of your modern life can be summarized in the words of your poet Thoreau? Improved means to an unimproved end. Through your scientific genius, you have made of the world a neighborhood, but you have failed to employ your moral and spiritual genius to make of it a brotherhood. He goes on to say that the atomic bomb we have to fear today is not the atomic bomb that drops from a plane, but the atomic bomb which lies in the hearts of men capable of exploding into the most staggering hate. Again, could this have been written last week? He says, as he closes, what is the summum bonum of life? I think I have found the answer, America. I have discovered that the highest good is love. This principle is at the center of the cosmos, the great unifying force of life. God is love. He who loves has discovered the clue to the meaning of ultimate reality. He who hates stands in the immediacy, candidacy for non-being. He says it has always been the responsibility of the church to broaden horizons and challenge the status quo. The church must exert its influence in the area of economic justice. As guardian of the moral and spiritual life of the community, the church cannot look with indifference on these glaring evils. The moral and spiritual guardian of the life of our community. So we could have the gift of scientific prediction and understand the behavior of molecules, but if we have not love, the greatest of all virtues is love. So in a world depending on force, coercive tyranny, and bloody violence, you are challenged to follow the way of love. I take up that challenge. Martin Luther King Jr. I take it up in 2018. In a day when the atomic bomb of hatred has exploded in people's hearts, and where the only weapon is unarmed love. Then and now. Amen.